My name is Thomas Wahl, and I'm an assistant professor in CECE, and I'm also a member of the Sustainable Coastal Systems Cluster. I'm originally from Germany, where I got all my degrees at the University of Siegen. After that, I did a postdoc for almost 3 years at the UCF College of Marine Science here in Florida in St. Petersburg. After that, I thought I would continue my career in Europe. I got an EU fellowship, a Marie Curie fellowship, which I used to go to the University of Southampton in the UK, which is a great school, terrible weather. So after 1 year, we were very happy to come back to Florida, and I joined UCF in spring 2017, where I'm now directing the Coastal Risks and Engineering Lab. And we just put a new website together under this link here, which is not 100% finished, but almost. My research is at the interface of coastal engineering and different science disciplines, including physical oceanography, hydrology, climate science, a little bit of meteorology and atmospheric science. And you can see here that we have a relatively broad range of funding agencies currently supporting our grants. And from a spatial perspective, we do pretty much anything that's related to coastal flood risk, from the global scale through continental regional scale, all the way up to global scale. I'm teaching hydrology and hydraulics at the undergraduate level, and I developed a coastal systems analysis class 2 years ago, where we look at all the different aspects of sea level rise, the associated impacts, and the possible adaptation options to mitigate these negative impacts. And this class is actually offered this fall, so if you have any students who are interested in these topics, please encourage them to enroll. We pretty much start from scratch, so anyone who is interested can join us. Some key achievements listed here at the bottom. One of these grants that is listed at the top or in the middle is the NASA Early Career Award. And they also received an Outstanding Early Career Scientist Award from the European Geosciences Union. Now, looking at coastal flood risk means that we are dealing a lot with sea level changes. And this here just highlights that sea level is really made up of many different components. When you guys go out to the beach and you look at the water levels that you see, the waves rushing up the beach, this is made up of many different components, starting with the base water level here at the bottom. MSL stands for mean sea level. And when we talk about sea level rise, we usually talk about changes in mean sea level. On top of that, we also have tides, we have storm surges, we have wave action, and all of these different components are combined to make up the total water level, which can then lead to erosion and flooding. And all these different components exhibit different spatial and temporal variations, which we try to understand for the past, present, and future to incorporate this information into coastal design and adaptation planning. In coastal areas, we also have the big challenge that it's not just these oceanographic drivers that can cause flooding, we also have freshwater drivers, precipitation and river discharge in deltas and estuaries, which can combine with these oceanographic drivers to then lead to what we call compound flooding. And these compound flooding events, and we had many examples over the last few years, Irma, Florence, Harvey, all caused compound flooding. These events are often very high impact, but they are not very well covered or covered at all in many of our design guidelines or risk assessments. So many of our projects actually center around this topic of compound flooding. And I picked a few examples here today to showcase some of the results that we achieved. This is a very local analysis that we conducted in collaboration with the South Florida Water Management District. They are managing a very complex watershed with a lot of flood control structures down in South Florida. And they're very concerned about the coincident occurrence of high ocean water levels and high precipitation and also high groundwater table, because if the groundwater table is very high, it means that a certain precipitation event is more likely to cause flooding. Now, in order to include these compound flooding effects into risk assessments, we need to extend the traditional univariate extreme value models that we typically use for design in order to account for more variables. We have to expand and use multivariate models to account for the different drivers. And there are many options. One type of models that's quite flexible are so-called copular functions. Those are multivariate distributions that can be used to calculate joint probabilities, as we did here in this example for rainfall and ocean level. So we are looking here at the joint probabilities between these two drivers. And on this yellow-orange contour lines that you can see, every event combination that falls onto this contour line would be considered a 100-year event. And then it's a little bit more tricky now how to select an appropriate design event. There are many ways of doing it. One is to just look at the density along this contour line. And this is what we did. And we got this black diamond here that you can see in the middle of the graph. And we could compare this to what the Florida Water Management District currently does in their design. And they have a very conservative assumption where they assume that there's perfect dependence between high ocean water level and high precipitation. And that's the design value that they would pick under this assumption. So one thing that we were able to tell them based on our analysis is how long will it take with sea level rise? Because sea level rise is going to shift the ocean water level upwards. How long will it take before this safety margin that they kind of implicitly include in their design will be used up? And that, of course, depends very much on how fast sea level is going to rise in the future. Now, some possible areas of collaboration that I can see here is just the fact that these multivariate extreme value models that we have been developing and using, not just in the bivariate case, as I'm showing here, but also for multivariate assessments. They are very flexible. And I know they have been used in other disciplines, transportation engineering, but maybe there are some other applications where these types of models can be exploited. So whenever you deal with multivariate data sets, you have dependent structures, especially if you have dependence in the tails of the distributions and you have mixed data sets, mixed marginal distributions, then these tools come in very handy. Moving from local to more regional scale analysis, this is a project that is funded jointly by NSF here in the US and NERC in the UK, where we are working with colleagues at the University of Southampton. And here we conduct a more regional scale analysis of compound flood risk, taking into account all the different drivers that I mentioned before, the oceanographic drivers, extreme precipitation, extreme discharge, and we focus on the US and the Northern European coastlines. The results here are very preliminary. The project started a few months ago. This is for the combination of storm surge and discharge. And on the left-hand side, we just look at the database. We look at the data that we have available to perform the analysis, and we only focus on observational data for now. Later on, we will complement that with some model results as well. And you can see we have pretty good data sets. We have relatively long, several decades usually, of overlapping observations from river gauges and tide gauges. And then we always start with a simple dependence analysis. So on the right-hand side, you can see the results from looking at Kendall's rank correlation tau between these two flooding drivers. And you can already see that there is a hotspot here in the southeast, including the Florida Peninsula, where these two flooding drivers show relatively high dependence. And that is likely because we are prone to tropical cyclones, which we all know can cause storm surge, extreme precipitation, and then high river discharge. Now, in the next steps, we will also extend this analysis to perform more of a joint probability analysis. Having these long data sets, we also want to look at non-stationarity. Are there any changes in the dependencies between the different flooding drivers? We want to look at the weather types, which weather types have caused compound flooding in the past. And then we can look into climate model results as well, climate model output, and see if it's more likely for us to see a higher or lower frequency of these weather types that cause compound flooding in the future. And finally, we will also select some case study locations for more detailed modeling where we will actually look at impacts of compound flooding. And Jacksonville is one of our candidate locations at the moment, but it hasn't been decided yet. Now moving from regional continental scale all the way to global, we are only looking at parts of the results here for the US East Coast. So this is the first global analysis of what we call the spatial footprint of storm surges that one of my postdocs just finished. So here we are not looking at the correlation or the dependence between different flooding drivers. We are only looking at one driver, which is storm surge. But we are now looking at spatial dependencies. So instead of asking the question, how likely is it to see storm surge and rainfall to coincide, we ask questions such as, how likely is it that cities like Boston, New York, and Atlantic City, for example, are all affected at the same time by a storm surge? Or what is the probability that critical infrastructure elements, ports, for example, are affected simultaneously? And here I can see a clear path for collaboration by linking this stuff to infrastructure network analysis, which could include transportation, energy, water resources, but also military installations. One project, for example, that we have under review, a proposal is with DoD CERDP, where we say we want to look at the probability that multiple military installations are affected at the same time, which then very quickly becomes a matter of national security. Now, my research plan for the near term is to expand from just focusing on flooding to take more of a multi-hazard risk approach. And we currently have one project funded by the National Academies of Sciences that allows us to do that. We want to look at the remote connections of flooding drivers, coastal and inland. That is part of the CERDIP DoD proposal that I mentioned. We just learned that one of our proposals was selected for funding from the US Coastal Research Program, where we will combine the statistical models that I briefly touched on here today with numerical process-based modeling to assess compound flooding for some of the US estuaries, and that will be done in close collaboration with FEMA in this case. And we also recently learned that our NASA Sea Level Science Team proposal was recommended for funding, and that one would look more at the spatio-temporal variability of the different sea level components that I mentioned at the beginning. So this will drift more into the sea level science field. Now for the long term, and I'm already starting to do that, but one thing that I find is very important is to take this, and the next step will be to use it for integrated impact and adaptation assessments. So right now, my playing field has been here at the top, the climate change drivers, looking at the different hazards and how they are affected by climate change. In order to understand the impacts and develop adaptation pathways for the future, we need to integrate this with other drivers, non-climatic drivers, socioeconomic drivers, land use change, but also equity issues, because the most vulnerable people, unfortunately, are often the ones who are most affected by these hazards. So when we develop adaptation pathways for the future, we have to take this into account. And there are different programs that I can see being responsive to something like that. We had actually one proposal reviewed by NAS, unfortunately was not selected for funding, but reviews were quite good. So we are trying to revise this now and resubmit it somewhere else. The NSF just started the Coastlines and People program, where we'll probably be involved in a couple of proposals later this year. And then NSF PIA is also very interesting because I'm involved in a lot of international initiatives, and that could provide funding for these groups. Another natural extension of the work that I have been doing would be to look at cascading hazards. So for now, I've focused on multivariate events. We looked at spatial dependencies, but of course we can also look at temporal dependencies and these cascading hazards, which unfortunately we have also seen a lot more of those over the last few years. And that might be a potential topic for an NSF Career Award. Now, at the end of the day, I am not really doing any of these things. I just have my moments where I have some halfway decent ideas, but then these guys here, they pick it up and they develop it further and then they implement it, and they do a really great job at that. And one funding source that I didn't show on my first slide, but really want to mention is actually UCF, and in particular the P3 program. So these three guys here at the top have been supported by this program. And I think by now they have written proposals that are combined worth more than $1 million and have been co-PIs on these proposals. Not all of them got funded, but some of them did. So I think in addition to checking a box for the preeminent status, I think this program also really sets us apart from other schools and probably has a very good return of investment. And I will stop here and try to answer your questions. Thank you very much.